We are now officially into the fantasy football playoffs, and if you guys have had a chance to make the dance, it's time to go and secure your championships. It starts in round 1, it ends in round 3. You guys got to make sure you win every single game moving forward if you want the ultimate prize. But like always, I got you guys covered with my top 30 wide receivers in the tier list format, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays. Like I said, it is crunch time. You guys got to make those start-sit decisions. You got to make them well, and I will do my best today to help you guys make those tough choices when it comes time for your lineup. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your biggest start-sit decisions. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Again, it is crunch time. I want you guys to win your matchup, so I will make sure I answer as many as possible. With that being said, let's waste no more time and let's get right into it. All right, before we get into the top 30, as always, I will be going through my will they play tier. Basically, the general thumb here is we'd like to see at least one full practice prior to Sunday's games, and if they don't, I would lean towards a slightly lower ranked counterpart. So the two guys in the will they play tier this week happen to be DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears and Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So starting off with DJ Moore, he missed Wednesday's practice with a reported ankle injury that he suffered in Sunday's game. Reportedly, he returned on Thursday in limited fashion, and by all accounts, it does seem like he is ready to play on Sunday. He did suffer it during the game, like I said. He was able to finish it. I do think with the Bears, they want to build that momentum, that rapport that he has with Justin Fields. Assuming he does play, he is a top 12 level option in my lineups this week. Chris Olave, wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints, injury described as an ankle sprain that he suffered against the Panthers. Did not practice on Wednesday or Thursday, and if you do have Chris Olave, I would be extremely nervous at his playing status if I do have him. Even if he does play, it looks like he could be hindered a lot by this injury, and if he does suit up, I will be downgrading him to wide receiver 3 status, but I do think there is a high likelihood that he could sit out based on the reports. You got to monitor his status today and tomorrow to determine whether or not he makes your lineup, but like I said, even if he does play, I do expect him to be hindered, so my wide receiver 2 expectation on normal weeks now becomes a fringe top 25 to 30 level wide receiver. And of course, as you guys know, week 15, there are no bye weeks this week. So no players in your lineup that are not ready for action. So don't worry about that. Obviously, we've talked about the bye weeks in the past. No teams on bye for week 15 this week. But we can go straight over to my top 12 wide receivers, starting off with the 3 I'll talk about in the 1 to 6 range. First of all, being my wide receivers 1 and 5 respectively, CeeDee Lamb of my beloved Dallas Cowboys, and of course, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills in that pivotal matchup, 4:25 kickoff in Buffalo in Highmark Stadium this Sunday. Myself and Corey will actually be attending that game, so it'll definitely be fun to watch live. And we're in store for an absolute score fest. We're in store for 2 offenses that are playing really good football, and I'm expecting a lot of points to be happening in this game. The game environment here is obviously tremendous, and I love both of the alphas in their respective receiving cores. It's tied for the highest over-under of the entire slate at 50.5 points, and the over is getting absolutely seamed by the Sharps this week. It makes sense, though, given the team projection tweeted out by Hayden Winks here. Both the Buffalo Bills and the Dallas Cowboys project as elite offensive matchups in this game, something to monitor going into the weekend. But starting off with CeeDee Lamb, he's my wide receiver 1 on the entire slate, and he has been a complete difference maker since week 6. Obviously, on the season as a whole, averaging almost 22 PPR points per game. But when you isolate this from week 6 on, once the Cowboys offense figured their groove, post that San Francisco 49ers embarrassment of a loss, when you isolate that out, man, he has been the fantasy football MVP. He is averaging over 26 PPR points per game. He has been the number 1 wide receiver in that stretch, and I do think this continues in a favorable matchup for opposing wide receivers against Buffalo, whereas with Tyreek Hill, he has a very tough matchup against New York Jets. That's the big difference here, why CeeDee Lamb's my 1, why Tyreek's my 2. On typical matchup weeks, it would usually be Tyreek Hill, but I have to give the lean towards CeeDee Lamb given the matchups for both of those players this week. And then on the flip side with Stephon Diggs, he has a much tougher matchup on the other side. This Cowboys team has been very good against opposing wide receivers this year, but the Bills are still implied for over 26 points in this game. They're home favorites this week. Must-win type of matchup to potentially clinch their playoff spot down the stretch. And I still think Stephon Diggs is an elite player. Obviously, he has not been the same fantasy football asset in these last couple of weeks, but he's still commanded 30 targets in his last 3 games, and I do expect him and Josh Allen to work out their kinks against the Cowboys this week. Desperation mode, the Bills, like I said, basically needing to win out to secure their playoff spot, and I expect Josh Allen to lean on his best separator against a man coverage heavy defense like the Cowboys represent. And then my wide receiver 6, and I just want to say welcome back to the elite graces of fantasy football wide receivers. we got Cooper Kupp going up against the Washington Commanders this week. And Kupp showed he should not be written off just yet this past week against the Ravens. Big time performance. The offense looks like it's starting to peak. Matthew Stafford's playing some very good football, and Kupp in his own right looked as healthy as he has ever been this season. The Rams this week are implied for 28.5 points, which is the second most points on the entire slate, only behind the San Francisco 49ers. And with Matthew Stafford, like I said, he's playing some of his best football this year. And I do think that with the way that the Rams are playing, they are going to be vying for a playoff spot in the NFC. Cooper Kupp this week, big advantage against that Washington defense that's basically let every single other wide receiver core go absolutely bonkers on it this year. Weak secondary, obviously pass rush is getting hindered by the trades of Chase Young and Montez Sweat at the deadline. I do think that the Rams have their way against this defense this week. But moving on to the wide receiver 7 to 12 range, we start off with my wide receiver 7 on the slate with Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers at home. And his development into this stud number 1 alpha wide receiver has really been in sight to see. He's commanded a 31% seasonal target share, and his numbers since Gardner Minshew took over have been even better. You guys see the splits right now, but since Gardner Minshew was announced a starter back in week 6, we've seen Michael Pittman command 34% of the targets and average nearly 19 PPR points per game in that stretch. 18.9 PPR points per game, 34% target share. He's gone over 10 targets in 7 of his last 8 games. Matchup against Joey Porter Jr. and the Steelers on the docket. Don't get me wrong, Joey Porter's a very good wide receiver in his own right, but I got to trust the way Michael Pittman's been playing, the volume he's commanding, that he can get over this matchup this week. I love his outlook moving forward, and I think every week moving forward, he has to be viewed as a locked-in stud number 1 wide receiver. And moving on to my wide receivers 9 and 12 respectively, and there's a noticeable difference right here because I do have Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, wide receivers of the San Francisco 49ers, going on the road to play the Arizona Cardinals. I've been a guy who's had Brandon Ayuk higher ranked than Deebo Samuel all season, but it's been tough to deny just how dominant Deebo Samuel has been in this last month. Again, I have to acknowledge that Deebo's usage in these past few weeks should lean him as the wide receiver 1 for the San Francisco 49ers. When you compare them straight up, he has a higher target share comparative to Brandon Ayuk, and he has been averaging more fantasy points per game in this last month. Like I mentioned, again, the targets are obviously there, and he also, of course, gets that out of the backfield, goal line usage we have seen as a rushing threat in this offense. This offense is a well-oiled machine. I think both these guys are absolute stud plays, wide receiver 1s this week. But if I do have both, my lean would be towards Deebo Samuel, given just how dominant he's been as of late. But you guys need to start these guys like I mentioned at the top. So now let's spend some more time diving into my wide receivers 13 to 30. Starting off with my wide receiver 13, and a guy that typically would be a lot higher, but we have Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings going on the road to play the Cincinnati Bengals at my 13 spot. Again, like I said, typically much higher, but the expectations that I have for him are a little bit skewed based on the situation he has at hand. First of all, he does have Nick Mullins at quarterback. Obviously, when he was dominating at the early portion of the season, did have Kirk Cousins in that stretch. On top of all that, you also have that chest injury he dealt with this past week. Believe it's been described as broken ribs. He went to the hospital for it. Definitely not a comfortable experience if you're Justin Jefferson. He's already said he's going to play in this game. Don't necessarily know if he's going to be hindered at all. Is he going to be hurt during this game? Obviously, is he pushing it because the Vikings are in the playoff contention? A lot of questions that I have for Justin Jefferson. However, I can't rank him lower than this. He's still a superstar elite level talent, and he can make me look foolish. Like if he goes out there, has 7 catches, 135 yards, and 2 touchdowns, I'm going to be looking silly for not having him as a wide receiver 1. I just think given the risk level, given the things at hand here, I want to be cautious with my expectation towards Justin Jefferson in his return. My wide receiver 14 actually played on Thursday Night Football. By the way, what a crazy game. Obviously, the LA Chargers with their backup quarterback. 63-21 loss to the Raiders this week. Fired both Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco after the game, but we were able to see Davante Adams show exactly what Davante Adams brings to the table. 12 targets, 8 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and a touchdown this week. 24.1 PPR points. If you guys made the playoffs and have Davante Adams on your team, you were mighty impressed with that stat line that he was able to put up. And if Aiden O'Connell is able to play like that on a week-to-week basis, I do think we have to be looking at Davante Adams as a wide receiver 1 moving forward. But moving on to my wide receivers 15 and 16 respectively, we have Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles and DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Big time Monday Night Football game between the Eagles and the Seahawks in Seattle this week. I'm expecting an absolute barn burner. But let's start off with the game environment in this game. 47.5 over-under with the Sharps hammering the over at a 96% rate. I expect this, like I said, to be an absolute heat seeker. I think both offenses on either side hold significant advantages over the defenses. And like I said, I am expecting the over to hit at a high rate this week. Starting off with Devontae Smith, of course, with the Philadelphia Eagles. Much maligned after 2 separate blowouts against both the 49ers and the Cowboys in recent weeks. But I do think this is the bounce back spot for this Eagles offense. There's still too much talent. They hold too much of an advantage over the Seahawks. And with Devontae Smith himself, he has 37 targets and 18.6 PPR points per game in the 4 games since the Eagles bye week. He's been on a very good stretch. He's a very good player, and I do think he has the advantage against this struggling Seahawks secondary. On the same token with DK Metcalf, he also has a very advantageous matchup this week. He's going up against an Eagles secondary that ranks as the 3rd easiest matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers. DK's been playing better football as of late, and I do expect that to continue against this Eagles defense that has conceded 75 points in their last 2 games against the Cowboys and Niners, respectively. My wide receiver 17 this week is actually DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans, going to play the Houston Texans at home this week. And there's a little bit of a revenge game narrative here, obviously, for D-Hop, drafted by the Texans, played a lot of his prime years for the Houston Texans with Deshaun Watson as his quarterback. Nice revenge spot with that interdivisional rivalry between the Titans and Texans this week. And with DeAndre Hopkins, he's commanded 24 targets and has 44.3 PPR points in his last 2 games. Him and Levis are really developing the strong rapport. DeAndre Hopkins on his own right has been playing better football. Will Levis really developing, settling in at that quarterback spot for the Titans this week. And I really think that the Texans represent an advantageous matchup for Hopkins this week. And the Titans are implied for a respectable 20.5 points. Vegas is starting to respect this offense. They've played, like I said, 2 straight really good football games against the Colts and against the Dolphins, respectively, on Monday Night Football. And I expect this momentum to continue this week against Houston. I think this is a sneaky spot for Houston. Obviously, Houston potentially without CJ Stroud in this game. I do think that the Titans have a very good shot at winning this game outright. And then my wide receiver 18 this week is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, going to play the Detroit Lions on the road this week. And he's been on an absolute touchdown tear all year, 10 touchdowns in his 13 games played. It's propped him up to wide receiver 2 territory, even if the volume hasn't quite followed suit. With Courtland Sutton, he is averaging 13.6 PPR points per game this season, which is his highest mark since his breakout second-year campaign, where he averaged 13.77 PPR points per game. And with Courtland Sutton, the Broncos are implied for nearly 22 points this week, a high over-under game on Saturday night with shootout potential against the Lions. And obviously, like I mentioned, if the Broncos are scoring points, again, 22 implied points, Courtland Sutton has a lot of touchdown equity in this offense. So like I said, if the Broncos score some points, I'm expecting Courtland Sutton to find pay dirt this week. But now we move on to my low-end wide receiver 2, starting off with my wide receivers 19 and 21 respectively. We got Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins and Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Big-time matchup, Jets traveling to Miami this week for that interdivisional matchup. And we saw this matchup just a few weeks ago on Black Friday, but this time, of course, the Jets are traveling to Miami in this game. Game environment is not very great at all. 37 set over-under with both teams being implied for less points than they usually are. For Jalen Waddle, it sucks that we haven't seen this huge breakout game for him quite yet this year, although he did have a solid game this past week, 6 catches, 79 yards, which paced the Miami Dolphins this past week. The Jets are an elite defense in their own right, do not get me wrong. They are absolutely vicious against opposing wide receivers, but I do think that the usage uptick we saw from Jalen Waddle is promising for him moving forward. I do think despite the tough matchup, Miami obviously a very good offense in their own right. I do think Jalen Waddle can continue his success that he saw this past game. And with Garrett Wilson, he has the complete opposite problem. He gets the elite usage that we want to see, but the offense is just so bad that it hasn't really mattered this year. With Garrett Wilson, he is commanding a 32% seasonal target share, 48% share of the air yards on this team, and 40% of the targets in the end zone this year. He is just an absolute elite, game-changing #1 wide receiver, but the problem, of course, has been the quarterback play, has been the offensive performance for Garrett Wilson this season. Maybe Zach Wilson, shows some promise again this year. He's been pretty volatile at times. He'll show some signs, and then obviously we'll go through a stretch where he looks like a CFL-level quarterback. Although there's reason for optimism given how he played last week, the Jets are still implied for only 14.5 points, which is the lowest on the slate, despite the slate having a ton of backup quarterbacks on it. Wilson, like I said, is still a wide receiver 1 given the elite usage. I just want to see this guy with a good quarterback, man. I can't wait for if Aaron Rodgers is able to come back next year, if they have a better plan at quarterback next year, to rank Garrett Wilson as the top 5 guy he deserves to be. Wide receiver 20 for me is Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs, going on the road to play the New England Patriots this year. And we finally saw the Rice usage get an uptick. 85% snap share this week against Buffalo. And if he maintains that level of involvement moving forward, he will be much higher in my rankings. The past 3 weeks, he's commanded 29 targets and has averaged 19.1 PPR points per game. He is absolutely starting to heat up, absolutely starting to find his groove in this offense. In that stretch, 29% of the targets, 32% targets per route run, 33% of the end zone targets for this Patrick Mahomes Chiefs-led offense. And I think he's got a real opportunity now to be that established number 1 wide receiver, number 2 overall threat in this offense. And like we know with Patrick Mahomes, he's one of the best elevators at the quarterback position in the entirety of the NFL. And I do think that as long as Rashee Rice keeps seeing his snaps move forward, he could potentially be a top 15 option for me. Next up at wide receivers 22 and 24 respectively, we have Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars and Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Big time Sunday night football matchup. Baltimore travels on the road to play the Jacksonville Jaguars. And with Calvin Ridley to start us off, he has earned 36 targets in his last 4 games and has scored 17.4 PPR points per game in that stretch. He's been up and down all year, and the Ravens do present a tough matchup against opposing wide receivers. But we saw Trevor Lawrence really concentrate his targets on his top 3 wide receivers this past week. I expect another high volume day for Calvin Ridley, and he has the potential to heat up down the stretch if you guys have him in the fantasy football playoffs this week. On the other side with Zay Flowers, he saw an uptick in his usage this past game, evolving from that, gimmicky around the line of scrimmage role to running true big boy wide receiver routes down the field. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 60 yards, ends up posting 20 PPR points this past week. And with Zay Flowers, I really do think that if he continues this type of usage, he keeps getting more looks down the field, he could potentially, like I mentioned with Rashee Rice, vault himself towards that mid-range wide receiver 2 territory. And closing off my low-end wide receiver 2s tier, we do have Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons going on the road to play the Carolina Panthers this week. And he finally had his blow-up spot against the Buccaneers. He turned in 29.2 PPR points despite not scoring a touchdown. 10 receptions, 172 yards, and a 2-point convert on his 11 targets. He was dynamite. He was showing elite talent, and we love to see young players performing at that type of level like Drake London showcased this past week. Obviously, moving forward, the big question mark is how Desmond Ridder is going to perform, not to mention the Panthers being a relatively tough matchup against opposing wide receivers. But as volatile as the quarterback play has been this year, Drake London is still averaging over 12 PPR points per game. And in the instances where it wasn't a complete train wreck, he has shown legit high-end wide receiver 2 upside. I'm baking in the range of outcomes with Desmond Ridder, but I do think as long as he can perform at a serviceable level, Drake London has the chance to rise moving forward. But now we move on to my wide receiver 3, starting off with my wide receiver 25 this week with Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns going to play the Chicago Bears at home. We were able to see on full display the volume he's able to command this past week. 14 targets, 7 receptions, 77 receiving yards. And it is a bad game environment for Cleveland this week against a much improved Bears defense as of late. But Amari's involvement that he showed last week, and with how well Joe Flacco has been playing, I do trust him as a wide receiver 3 in my rankings. Limited ceiling given the game environment like I kind of mentioned. But like I said, the volume is going to be there. Joe Flacco has been playing well, and I do think he is in store for another double-digit target game. My wide receiver 26 this week is Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers, going to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at home this week. And it's very similar thoughts on Jaden Reed to what I have with Zay Flowers. Explosive athlete in the open space, and I'd like to see him run some more real-life, NFL wide receiver stuff, because I do think he's capable of it. Zay Flowers kind of showed those signs this past week. I do think that Jaden Reed is capable of lining up on the outside, beating defenders deep, really seeing that usage expand. And even if the usage down the field is not quite there yet, he's still earning elite volume and is getting carries out of the backfield to propel his fantasy viability. 15 plus PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games, and now gets a Buccaneers secondary that has been struggling against opposing wide receivers all year. Time I give Reed some flowers, he deserves to be a top 30 option for the time being. I also like his teammate Christian Watson, but I do think you have to give Jaden Reed the benefit of the doubt at this point as the Packers' number 1 wide receiver. Wide receiver 27 for me is Brandon Cooks of my Dallas Cowboys. Like I mentioned with CD and Stephon Diggs, big-time matchup in Buffalo this week. High stakes in that game. And with the Cowboys, they are second in neutral pass rate this month. In a game environment with the 50.5 over-under, with the steam on the over, he's basically just Dallas Gabe Davis at this kind of point. Cooks has, been a volatile week-to-week play, but he has shown elite-level ceiling once he does hit those spike weeks. For example, we saw it against the Giants, 32-plus PPR points. We have seen an evident ceiling for Brandon Cooks with how this offense is clicking, with how Dak Prescott has been playing. And in this type of matchup, like I mentioned with the game environment, he's also playing against a Bills defense that ranks as the league worst against opposing wide receivers in DVOA this year, I do think that Brandon Cooks has a smash spot to impress this week. Wide receivers 28 and 30 respectively, we have T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals and Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota traveling on the road to play Cincinnati this week. It's a very crucial matchup. Both of these teams need this win with their playoff aspirations on the line. Duel of backup quarterbacks. I'm really excited to see how this game unfolds. T. Higgins hasn't quite commanded the volume we'd like to see just yet with Jake Browning, but Browning has played some very good football in the absence of Joe Burrow, and we know T. Higgins has the talent to turn it around on any given play. With Jordan Addison on the other side, he has Nick Mullins throwing him the ball this week after Josh Dobbs got benched. I actually think this helps him in fantasy football. Mullins doesn't have the rushing tendencies that Josh Dobbs does, and he has shown he can at least be an efficient distributor anytime he's gotten an opportunity to start in his NFL career. Justin Jefferson obviously is back, which does hurt the overall volume for Jordan Addison, but I actually do like it because it takes pressure off of Addison. He's more of a big play wide receiver rather than a volume wide receiver, and I do think the presence of Justin Jefferson increases the viability of this offense to potentially score points. And with these duo of wide receivers, both teams are in advantageous spots against opposing wide receivers, and I think both have a good amount of upside despite the quarterback uncertainty at play. And then finally, my wide receiver 29 on the slate is Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers, traveling on the road to play the Indianapolis Colts. And Deontay Johnson is expected to play after suffering a knee injury Wednesday. He was quickly taken off of the injury report on Thursday, and there looks like there's no limitations towards him playing on Sunday. With Deontay Johnson, double-digit points in his last 2 games, and a good matchup against opposing wide receivers this week against a struggling Colts secondary. Some risk with him given his overall involvement has been down, and obviously the play of Mitch Trubisky is a very big question mark. With the playoffs on the line in the game against Indy, I do expect the Steelers to concentrate their targets to their best players this week, that being Deontay Johnson, that being George Pickens. But now we rapid fire my 5 favorite deeper league flex plays, starting off with number 1, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks, playing the Philadelphia Eagles, like I mentioned, Monday Night Football. He really had a bounce back week this past week, 6 catches, 89 receiving yards in that bounce back game. I mentioned the game environment when I was talking about DK Metcalf, and I love Lockett's skill set against this secondary with Geno Smith back. I'm expecting some big plays. I'm expecting the Seahawks to lean on that passing attack, given that the Eagles are a big pass funnel defense. Number 2, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, traveling on the road to play the Green Bay Packers. And the usage was concerning for a long bit. We didn't see Chris Godwin get the typical usage we were used to seeing, but we did see that bounce back in a big way against Atlanta. 11 targets, 5 catches, 53 receiving yards in that game. The Packers represent an advantageous matchup against opposing wide receivers this year. I'm expecting Godwin to keep this momentum with Tampa Bay fighting for a playoff spot and potentially the NFC South crown. Number 3, we got Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals playing the San Francisco 49ers at home this week. And with Marquise Brown, obviously the last game we saw him in, he did put up a goose egg against the Pittsburgh Steelers, but he did see 12 targets in that week prior against LA, and he got a week off to get healthier after fending with that heel injury he suffered. And the Niners struggle against wide receivers outside of the numbers. I feel like this is a positive, get right spot for this Cardinals passing attack. What should be a positive pass script this week, with the Niners assuredly putting points up on the other side. Again, 30.5 implied points for that Niners offense this week going against the Cards D. Number 4, we got Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills playing the Dallas Cowboys at home this week. And he's been disappointing, but like Brandon Cooks, I want access to this game environment. And the Cowboys' man-heavy coverage could give Gabe Davis some fits, but he is a big-time touchdown threat for Josh Allen. And I think in this type of game, it is a good process to throw him into your flex spot. He's not the most consistent player like we know, but this guy can flat out win weeks when he hits those spike weeks, and we want to trust that in this type of game environment for the Bills this week. And then number 5, we got Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants traveling on the road to play the New Orleans Saints. And I mentioned him on the waiver show if you guys tuned into that earlier this week, but we did see his best usage of the season by far. He looks healthy. He looks evidently healthier than he did early on this season. And the Saints, although they are a tough matchup against opposing wide receivers, Robinson gets scheme touches across the formation out of the backfield. And I do really love his volume ceiling like he showed against the Packers this past week. But either way, like I said, if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. Like I said, it is playoff weeks. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 40,000. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. But with that being said, peace out. Good luck in your matchups. Go make your semifinals. Take care.